I'm from Missouri, and we have an expression that goes like this. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I grew up on a small farm. My father was killed in an accident on the farm. My mom and I ran the farm for 4 years before I went to college. I studied anthropology, agriculture, global food systems. Since then, I've worked with farmers, famine victims, refugees. I've worked with the biggest multinational food companies on the planet, and this is what I've found. If we don't get where and how we produce food right, in the next 40 years, we can turn out the light and go home. Because the planet that we call our own is not going to be recognizable. Right now, we're eating the planet. Agriculture is the biggest threat. And that's today. Going forward, we're going to have to produce as much food in the next 40 years as we have in the last 8,000. Agriculture has the largest impact on the planet of any human activity. Here's some of the issues. It's the largest cause of deforestation, the largest cause of biodiversity loss. It uses more water than any other human activity. In fact, twice as much as all other human activities combined. We take about 1 liter of water today to make 1 calorie of food. It produces more pollution than any other human activity. Uses more chemicals. Produces more greenhouse gases. In fact, the greenhouse gas production just from clearing forests to create new land to farm each year is equal to all transportation greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. And we're not managing the planet. We're not managing the soil that we need for future production. Since 1850, we've lost half of the topsoil on the planet. 70% or more of farmers today produce less topsoil each year than they lose. That's not sustainable. We've got to freeze the footprint of food. Now, in Europe and the United States, we think that we're living in a global recession. These countries, in the last year or so, grew at 7% a year. And these countries grew at 5% or more a year. There's a lot of growth going on, it's just not with us. And that growth translates into increased consumption. We just heard that population is going to plateau around 2050. The problem is income is not. And from income, then also consumption is not. And while population is going to peak, there's no end in sight for consumption. We don't know where that's going to go or when it's going to stop. Eight countries produce enough surplus calories to feed the gaps in the world food production every year. With variable climate, we're beginning to see some changes in those 8 countries. This year, 4 of them have had major droughts. What's that going to do to food availability going forward? And it's not just these countries that are the problem. 2 countries represent 1/3 of the people on the planet. India's had a bad monsoon. For the last 4 years in a row, China has barely fed itself. What's going to happen this year? As the old saying goes, when China buys rice, the world trembles. The group I work for, WWF, doesn't buy food. We don't sell food. We can't work on everything. So what can we do? We've identified the 35 most important places from a biodiversity point of view and from an ecosystem point of view. We've then analyzed what are the most important threats to those places. And it's these 15 commodities. And guess what? It's not the US and Europe that are driving these commodities anymore. It's China. It's India. It's a new world out there. Get over yourself. How do we change the commodities? Do we work with the 7 billion consumers today, soon to be 9, maybe 10 going forward? Do we work with 1.5 billion producers? Or do we work with the 300 to 500 companies that buy and sell up to 70% of those commodities? Well, we think the answer is pretty obvious. If not easy, we've got to work with those companies. And what we found is that 100 companies buy and sell 25% of all 15 of those priority commodities. And that 25% of demand will pull 40 to 50% of production as producers compete to sell into those markets. We've signed agreements to work with 55 of those different companies, and we're doing some good work. In fact, we're doing some great work. But one by one by one is not going to get us there fast enough if you look at what's coming by 2050. We've got to work with groups of companies, entire industries, and transform them. That's one of the reasons that we're working with the Consumer Goods Forum. 400 companies, largest retailers and brands in the world, representing about $3 trillion of sale each year. They've made a commitment to take deforestation out of their supply chains. They're being strategic. 4 commodities, 4 countries, half of global deforestation. It's something they can get their arms around. The US government has actually decided to help them, announced in Rio Plus 20 that it wanted to bring more companies to the table, more governments to enable these companies to meet this commitment, because the US actually doesn't think governments can solve these problems. The private sector needs to get engaged. Some banks heard about what these retailers and brands were doing, and they said, if they can do it, we can do it. So they're deciding to take deforestation out of lending portfolios, and 10 global banks have agreed to start with palm oil in Indonesia. Hopefully they'll move on to soy and beef in Brazil. If we can take deforestation out of supply chains, can we bring carbon back into them? Right now, we don't pay for the cost of producing commodities. We don't pay for deforestation. We don't pay for soil erosion. We don't pay for water pollution. We've got to figure out how to internalize those costs. Some companies are beginning to think about this. In fact, we have global carbon markets, so they're seeing, can we bring carbon into commodity pricing? Tetra Pak is one of these. They've reduced their energy use by 30%, and they only buy green energy. But if you look at their entire value chain, they're insignificant as a player in the carbon that's embedded in the products they sell. They need to work with us raw material suppliers and others to actually make more carbon neutral products. We're never going to get to carbon neutrality, but we can get better. Now, what all this means is commodity systems are going to have to change. Commodity systems were created in the 1850s to make 1 ton of yellow corn equal to 1 ton of yellow corn anywhere in the world. Now we're asking them to do more. They were created to allow companies to buy raw materials and not have to change formulations every time they bought a ton of sugar. And they're very efficient at that, and they achieve scale. They focused on things that you could verify, weights, measures, colors, etc. About 40 years ago, we started to ask commodity trading systems to do different things. Is a product organic? Is it GMO? Is it range-free? Is there any child labor involved? You can't look at a product and see if that's the case or not. We need the efficiency of global trading systems. We all depend on them. But now we need them to be more than just efficient. We need them to be traceable. We need them to be transparent. In the age of information, we need more information. This is going to have costs. How can we cover those costs? How can we change this system? Every company in the world depends on raw material supplies. Every company in the world has an interest in making sure there are raw material supplies. In fact, we're beginning to see that sustainability is a pre-competitive issue. The products you make from those raw materials, how you sell them, how you market them, where you sell them, that's competitive. Whether they exist or not is pre-competitive. So there's a couple of ways that we might begin to address this issue in our commodity systems. Commodity trading now is full of transactions. They're transactional. They're spot market purchases, hundreds, thousands of purchases in the same month, in the same year, by the same company from the same suppliers. What if we could introduce 1, 3, or 5-year contracts that covered 70% of the purchases and reduce those transaction costs? Who would be willing to pay for that? Would buyers like that? Would sellers like that? The average cost of certification of commodities is 1%. All we have to do is find 1% to make this work. And if we can get one company to buy products over a longer period of time, then maybe we can get 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. What company wouldn't want, what Cargill of the world wouldn't want to be able to sell products to that many companies? Would they be willing to cover the cost of certification to do that? That's the kind of thing we're going to need to transform these markets. Companies manage the planet today. Governments don't. Governments are managing their piece of it at best. But in Copenhagen, in Durban, and in Rio, governments are arguing about periods and commas and what's in the brackets. They're not actually trying to figure out solutions to these problems. We need government at the table, but we can't wait. We've got to get moving. Think about it. Thank you.